They always put me after lunch, so as people start to doze off, I'll know why. But fortunately, these lights are bright enough I can't see anything in front of me. So we'll get going. So what I'm going to talk about today is just kind of the state of what's going on. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into some of the topics that have already been covered. Nobody stole my slides because I didn't deliver them until about 10:30 this morning. So hopefully they're all fresh. But I'll kind of go through some of what we've been seeing across the space, how we look at cyber threat in general from a company perspective, and then talk about little bits and bytes. It can get a little bit nerdy at times, but I'll try to gloss over that when possible. I have a laser too, so I got in trouble for it already. Just a little bit of background on me. I came out of the defense industrial base. I spent a number of years working in various government agencies and offices, and spent a lot of time at State Department, diplomatic security. So been tracking these threats for a while and been with CrowdStrike since the very beginning. And so I've been really focused on the threat intelligence perspective and what the threats are that are out there. And I always like to use this quote from Robert Clark, who wrote some fantastic books on intelligence and how to think about intelligence from a problematic standpoint and how to kind of focus analytics. And this quote is that intelligence is about reducing uncertainty by obtaining information that the opponent in a conflict wishes to deny you. And so for all of us, from a cyber threat perspective, that opponent is the adversary. And when we think about the adversary and who that adversary is, there's kind of three categories of adversary that we track, and this is really the motivation. A lot of times we talk about attribution, and there's lots of differing opinions. Being in the public sector Falcon event here, I think we're probably all more like-minded than in some of the other places where I give this talk. But effectively, the threat actors kind of fit into three categories. And we don't really start down the path of attribution until we understand what categories these threats fall into. The first one is nation state. This is typically conducted for espionage purposes. In some cases, we've seen actors like North Korea engage in financially motivated attacks in order to generate revenue. We've seen disruptive and destructive attacks that some of the previous speakers have spoken to. And this is kind of full scope capability for a nation state. And really it is becoming more and more problematic. We're seeing proliferation across new nations every year. And I'll kind of go into a few of them in a little bit. But this is a continuing problem. More and more that this gets covered in the press, the more that various nations see the capabilities that having an offensive cyber program give you, the more that they're looking to develop and create these capabilities. So this is kind of where we started from a CrowdStrike perspective, trying to understand nation-state actors, particularly around China, who has been very active over the last 10 years, stealing intellectual property and understanding our trade positions and understanding technology and things that we're trying to bring to bear in various markets. The next actor is, I don't know if this thing works. I think you guys just gave me like a button to, whoop, nope, sorry, this is going, go backwards. I'm looking at this screen and this screen's changing. So the other threat that we track is eCrime. This is financially motivated. And we've seen a really huge shift in what eCrime actors have been doing over the last 2 years. 3 or 4 years ago, eCrime was very much relegated to trying to steal bank account information of everybody in this room at an individual level. There wasn't a lot of thought that went into it, a lot of planning, and it wasn't particularly well organized. What we've seen since 2016 and really in the last year is that these eCrime actors are going after bigger and bigger scores, and they're getting much more advanced in their capabilities and how they think about these problems. And I think we'll get into that in a little bit in more detail. But eCrime does remain a pretty substantial threat. And then the third category that actors that we track fall into, we call hacktivist. And this tends to be geopolitically motivated, or we see them rallying around lots of different socially divisive topics, things like animal testing and income disparity and things along those lines. These actors tend to engage in disruptive, high-visibility attacks. They want to conduct a distributed denial-of-service attack. They want to deface a web page, or they want to leak sensitive information from an organization that they have some sort of fundamental problem with. So when we look at any cyber threat, the first step that we go through is to understand what category does it fall into? What is their motive, and what does that look like? In some cases, they'll make it look like it's a criminal motive, but when you start to peel back the layers, you can see pretty clearly it's actually a nation state. In the case of the Olympic destroyer attack in February of last year, we saw that Russian actors that we assessed to be Voodoo Bear, which is, I'll talk a little bit about the different actors, but a Russian actor tried to deliberately make it look as if this disruptive malware that targeted the opening ceremony of the Olympics was a North Korean threat. And once you peel back that kind of initial layer, you could see very quickly that the tooling aligned to things that we had previously seen from a known Russian threat actor. So in terms of the threat landscape for the public sector, and this is a kind of condensed version of it, but you can see here there's numerous threats to the public sector. This is state, local government, this is federal government, this is all of the services and other aspects of public sector. There's clearly a lot of Chinese threat actors. Some of these are now dormant or retired. There was a pretty significant reorganization of the People's Liberation Army back in 2016. And after that occurred, we've kind of been reshuffling the deck, and we're seeing different threat actors emerge. And some old ones still keep coming back, but this is kind of the exhaustive list of all of the Chinese threat actors we've observed targeting public sector. Here you can see Russia, no surprise there. Pretty much all of the Russian threat actors have targeted public sector here in the US. Some of these, like Energetic Bear, are no longer active. They were pretty badly outed back in 2014, but kind of want to give you some perspective that there's those threats out there. So we all know about the big two, and let's call it Iran as well as part of the big three. Lots of Iranian threat actors interested in public sector. Most of these actors are engaged in espionage. They're trying to steal information that could be useful. But as tensions start to flare between the US and Iran, or the US and China because of trade war, or the US and Russia, there's the potential that they can go a step further and start going into disruptive or destructive attacks. And we've seen Russia and Iran engage in those types of attacks before. And then we have India, which is tends to be more focused on regional issues and concerns. We've seen them targeting Pakistan very heavily, but they have, every now and again, targeted U.S. Public sector for intelligence collection. North Korea. North Korea is a pretty unique actor from a threat perspective. The North Korean actors do engage very heavily in espionage. They are really, really good at what they do. We've tracked North Korean threat actors that have gone after the SWIFT system, trying to steal hundreds of millions of dollars from the international banking system. We've seen them going after correspondent and intermediary banking systems like SPEI and things along those lines. They also heavily target cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is, when you're under heavy sanctions and you've been disconnected from the international financial system, having cryptocurrency is a great way to avoid some of these sanctions and to get access to the things that you would like to acquire. They conduct espionage as well against South Korea, the US, particularly when there's meetings going on, bilateral meetings or multilateral meetings. And we've seen them conduct disruptive and destructive attacks. Everybody here probably remembers Sony in 2014, but there's been a whole spate of disruptive and destructive North Korean attacks that have occurred. And we've even seen them take their destructive malware and repurpose it to cover the tracks from some of their financially motivated attacks. What we have seen from North Korea is what we call it the code pooling, where we see that they kind of develop different elements of code, different types of things that they could use in their malware, and then they can kind of check bits and pieces of it out to build a custom piece of malware for a specific mission. Criminal actors have been pretty active against the public sector as of recently, and I'm going to go into that in great detail. Here you can see we track all of these actors under SPIDER. I should state, I know Dimitri covered this briefly, but we track all of the different nation-state adversaries using an animal name that is representative of that nation-state. So panda for China, bear for Russia. Cholima is a made-up flying horse, which was just the kind of crazy we were hoping for. And we have criminal actors under SPIDER, and then we have hacktivist actors under JACKAL. And then the latest entrant that we've kind of really started paying attention to is what we call Ocean Buffalo. They've been around for a while. This is assessed to be Vietnam, and they have engaged in not only espionage and tracking of dissidents and persons of interest, but we start to see them engaging in industrial espionage and stealing information that can be helpful to state-owned enterprises or state-funded enterprises in Vietnam. Rob Joyce mentioned this a little bit, capabilities and intentions. And when we think about these threat actors, so we talk about the categories that they fall into, we talk a little bit about the attribution that we can kind of start to assess that we believe that they're subscribed to. And then we get into capabilities and intentions, which is really important when you start to think about what are the threats to your agency or organization. Because if you're from maybe a state and local government, you have less of a concern about North Korea, but you may have more of a concern about criminal actors. So a good thing that is always valuable to do is to assess both the capabilities and intentions and start to kind of project where these threats are. So, you know, hacktivists, terrorists, they tend to be on the much lower capability perspective, but higher on the intentions perspective. Now, terrorists tend to be, from what we've observed, more focused on using the internet for recruitment and for having secret communications. Hacktivists tend to be very focused on something that's high visibility and disruptive, but they tend to be very low sophisticated. Fire up the laser here. You can see down here we kind of have Pakistan, India, Vietnam. Their capabilities and intentions are pretty low. They're really, for the most part, Pakistan and India are very focused on each other. We've seen some pretty interesting techniques come out of India. One of the cooler ones that I've seen recently was they were targeting mobile devices. Anybody here have a mobile device? Everybody, yeah. Anybody here have an iPhone? Pretty much everybody. And so what they did was they deployed an MDM and then convinced their targets to install a profile so that they could capture all of their device communications through this mobile device management system, which was pretty innovative. So I'd give them a little bit higher on the capabilities side, probably. Criminal actors tend to be very high capability, and their intention is to make money. So if there's some way that they can make money either through extortion or through theft of accounts or other things like that, then they'll do it. You know, if energy company or a power plant, unless they have figured out a way to actually extort them to pay a ransom, they're probably not that interested. South Korea is an actor that we track as well under Shadow Crane. They have targeted public sector before and continue to be pretty active. They are very high on the sophistication, but we don't see them very often. They tend to be a little bit more reserved in what types of things they engage in. And then China, Russia, and North Korea are very active. They have capabilities and they have intentions for espionage and for disruptive purposes. So that's kind of where we spend a lot of time focused on what types of things they're into. Iran tends to have high intentions, moderate capabilities. They're very regionally focused right now. We're keeping a close eye on them, but their chief concern seems to be related to Saudi and UAE, particularly around Yemen issues and other regional political issues. So, you know, they could move in terms of targeting, I should mention this is capabilities and intentions of targeting the US public sector. So they could move much further in terms of the capability and intention scale into that top right corner if they are motivated to. That's a red box. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking through what we've observed. So in the last quarter, obviously we're wrapping up Q2 right now, so I don't have this data available for Q2, but you can see last quarter, this is the targeted intrusion. This is the nation-state adversaries that we've observed in terms of activity. You can see that there's a pretty healthy spread. We've seen North Korea, Pakistan, China, Iran, North Korea, Russia. Deadeye JACKAL is actually a hacktivist, but it's closely aligned with nation-state, with Syria. So we kind of lump it in here, and then another Iran. There's a whole mix of different actors there. And then you can see the verticals that they target. Now this is really good information to be able to track over time because it gives you an understanding of which threat actors and which verticals are being targeted and what types of things you need to be able to do to protect against them. Each one of these actors has some tradecraft associated with them, some tactics and techniques and tools that they use, and having the ability to understand that government's targeted by this particular actor gives you a better perspective on how to defend against these threats, where to prioritize, because you only have so many chips to play, right? You can't defend against everything all at once, so you need to really prioritize the things that are the biggest threat and will have the most impact to your organization in order to appropriately protect against that threat. Some of the recent things that we've been covering are, and I won't go through all of these because I think I'm pretty limited on time up here, but a couple of interesting things have just been occurring over the last few days here. You can see here the Windows credential interception activity by Berserk Bear. Berserk Bear has been operating very heavily against the US and energy targets for quite some time. And so they've been launching campaigns where they try to steal credentials, which they can then use for future operations. So that's something that we're tracking pretty closely. This is a new entrant to the ransomware. Anybody here heard of GandCrab? No? So GandCrab is another ransomware actor, and we've seen them, observe them starting to target SQL servers in order to create additional infrastructure for deployment. PLA, Strategic Support Forces, which is, I mentioned the reorg earlier. The PLA went from the traditional structure that they had, which was to have various military regions, and now they've kind of created more of a combatant command structure. And so they've appointed a new, they've gone into a new training cycle and appointed a new commander. Obviously, in the public sector, if you're in the federal side of the public sector, then the Huawei stuff is something that is a driver from Chinese perspective and something that they're pretty heavily interested in. And just a couple of other things I'll quickly point out. We've seen the Iran withdrawing from the JCPOA, and what types of things that might cause them to do as they start to move further and further away from being friendly with the P5 and start to think about protecting their own assets. What types of things might they target in the U.S.? Some of the intelligence that we provide also helps kind of, as you look about what's going on in the world and start to understand these threats, understanding which vulnerabilities need to be patched. I won't talk about the Baltimore things particularly, but you can see here, there's a lot of vulnerabilities that are constantly being cycled out there, whether they're publicly available or the adversary discovers a vulnerability on their own. They are doing this research. They're trying to figure out new ways to get into different environments. So understanding which vulnerabilities are being used actively in the wild allows you to prioritize which vulnerabilities you're going to patch. And I think my favorite one was kind of down here, was that Iran recently had a conference to simulate cyber attacks against industrial control systems. So guess what Iran's probably working on? Anybody been to Potter County, Texas? No? What about any of these places? Anybody know what these all have in common? Let me add one more. Yeah, so this is just since the start of the year, And probably not all of them. I think I left a few out. But there's clearly a pattern going on here where there is ransomware targeting state and local governments in an attempt to extort them to pay a ransom. These ransom demands go from hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars. And in many cases, certainly the victims don't want to pay it. And in many cases, they can't pay it. And they have to negotiate the price down. I've seen ransoms as high as 500 Bitcoin. Anybody here a big Bitcoiner? No? Just me? Bitcoin at 500 is several million dollars. And we've seen victims pay millions of dollars in ransom payments for the ability to decrypt their files. This evolved from what was really kind of more commodity. Back in 2016, we kind of called that the year of the ransomware, where we saw lots of different criminal actors engage in ransom attacks. And what that would involve is they would target everybody's computer, they would do large spam campaigns, and it was kind of spray and pray. If they got a couple hundred people to install this ransomware, they would charge them $400 or $500 for their family pictures and their tax records and things that they wanted to get back. And if you think about it, that's really inefficient. And I think they were really working for their money, to be honest. I think about, because these payments required you to go on Tor, the Onion router, to get cryptocurrency wallets, to transfer money over cryptocurrency. And I think about my father, who thinks he's not online until he hears that you've got mail from America Online, even though he has a cable modem. And trying to explain to him how to get onto Tor and how to get cryptocurrency you earned your money, I think, at that point. So these actors moved away from that because it was a lot of, and they have to support multiple languages. And what they started doing was targeting the enterprise. And what they figured out was, it's been attributed to Willie Sutton, why did you rob banks? He was an American bank robber. Why did you rob banks? And he said, well, that's where the money is. These actors have figured out that targeting individuals isn't where the money is. Targeting large operational environments, large enterprises, maybe state and local governments, healthcare, this is where the money is. And so in 2017, really into 2018, it took off, and this year it's exploded, is what we call big game hunting. Big game hunting is, rather than going after small little targets for a couple $100 per target, going after large enterprises and charging hundreds of thousands of dollars. For a couple of hours or a couple of days' work, this is an excellent return on an investment for these actors, and it gives them the ability to really start to generate some serious revenue. So, typically we're seeing $250,000 to $1 million in these ransom payments. And what they're using isn't some sort of super secret sauce. They're using penetration testing tools. They're using living off the land techniques where they leverage PowerShell, and Microsoft has like the HTML application engine on most systems. So they're using things that are present on the systems. If they're on Linux, they might look for Python or something like that. They're moving laterally, they're escalating privileges, and they're deploying ransomware across the entire enterprise, locking it down, and then charging an exorbitant amount of money to get the files back. Dimitri talked about the 11060 rule, and this is really where that becomes important. And while it might take a while for these threat actors to break out and to move laterally in the environment, once they do, it's pretty expensive for you to try to recover or defend from that type of attack. So there's been a kind of explosion of actors here. Now I will I want to first kind of acknowledge that DOJ indicted a couple of people in the Boss Spider case. There were a few Iranians that they identified as associated with that attack. And that absolutely shut down in November of this past year. When those indictments happened, I think that they realized that they probably were in a bad part of the world to be wanted by the US, and they stopped doing what they were doing. So that actor, we're calling that retired, Boss Spider, but that was the SamAs ransomware, and they were pretty effective for about 2 years and made a couple of $1 million. got ahead of myself here. Indrik Spider, anybody remember Dridex? Dridex was a commodity banking Trojan. It was very common for stealing credentials and trying to use that to get into account clearinghouse accounts and bank accounts. Well, they realized that that wasn't really profitable, and so now what they do is they will typically get in using this malware that they had that was very effective for what it was, and then they deploy BitPaymer, which is their ransomware tool, in order to charge really high ransoms. If you remember, the National Health Service in the UK was reportedly targeted by BitPaymer, and was one of the initial kind of cases where we saw, if you think of the history of big game hunting, Boss Spider being the first one that was really effective, these guys picked it up and realized that there was money to be made there. And then now we're seeing more and more actors kind of pile on. So Grim Spider is using a criminal malware called TrickBot, which they've kind of retooled and are now using to deploy Ryuk, which is a ransomware which is rampant in state and local and other places. Pinchy Spider is another one that's been using GanCrab, and that's been evolving through 2019. And we're tracking a few new actors. You may have heard of Locker Goga. And so we don't know actually how Locker Goga gets deployed. It's still pretty early in our analysis of this threat, but we know that they move laterally from what we've seen using penetration testing tools, living off the land techniques. They have a somewhat unusual but effective ransomware. They use AES encryption with embedded RSA keys. So a lot of ransomware will typically create RSA encryption at the file level, and then they'll wrap all the keys up with public key cryptography, RSA, and then send that back to the adversary. Frequently, you'll see Locker Goga use .locked. So once a file's been encrypted, they'll change the file name to .locked. They use a ransom note readme locked.txt. So if you see that, you should probably open it. And then they'll use email addresses, and we see them demanding $2-3 million in some cases for ransom payments. But this is one where you have to actually email them and say, hey, you locked all my computers, can I have my keys back? And then they start the negotiation. And they're really helpful. They'll tell you how they got in and how you can protect yourself in the future. They almost position it as if they're doing you a service. One of the things that we've observed them use, so I mentioned that they use PowerShell, but they'll use this test.bat script to deploy PowerShell, and then they use Cobalt Strike, which is used by many penetration testers and others to actually, as a post-exploitation framework. And then they'll use things like ADFind, PST Walker to go through PST files, PS exec to execute remote privileges. And then they use kill.bat to disable antivirus. So they look for Symantec and McAfee and some of the legacy antiviruses and turn them off in order to allow their ransomware to move effectively and to be able to lock the system. So they've had a lot of different versions. We've been tracking back to 0.0990. The original files were kind of packed, and now they're not really packed, but they're code signed. They use some really unusual libraries. So you can use the operating system to encrypt the file, or you could bring a bunch of bulky third-party libraries with you, and that's what they chose to do. Wouldn't be my choice, but that's why I'm here and they're there. They log off administrator accounts and change the password just to be jerks, I think would be the word. They want to make sure that you notice that your system's locked up and that you can't get back in. And then they don't limit the encryption to a list of extensions. So a lot of these criminal actors will whitelist files that they want to encrypt, and they'll leave other files in order to save time probably, but it also saves you some hassle in some cases. They don't do that. And just give you a little sense of the timeline. So we have the ability to track these threat actors, many organizations do. We have a mass repository of malware, so I kind of call it archaeology, malware archaeology, and we can go back and start to figure out what the earliest samples were. So the first version that we've been able to identify that conforms to what's now known as Locker Goga was version 0.9.9 from January of this year. And you can see that they've been pretty successful, and you get a sense of who they've been targeting. So what we find with a lot of these ransomware actors is that they go after state and local governments, they go after healthcare, they go after manufacturing, chemical companies, places that have a requirement to be up and operational. Everybody saw what happened in the city of Atlanta when they had ransomware attack last year. It crippled the city. We know what's going on in Baltimore today. So, you know, these are very good targets for ransomware because there's kind of urgency to get back up and running. And just a little chart, I think, that further kind of shows like the level of targeting that they've done. And then I just briefly wanted to touch on Robbinhood because I knew that other speakers would be talking about it here today, and it's certainly a topic of interest. So what we've seen from Robbinhood, which is the malware that's reportedly been used in Baltimore and other state and local government targets, we've seen multiple attacks that have been publicly attributed. It's developed in Golang, which I kind of describe as a hipster programming language. It wouldn't be my first choice. It's generally not very common for malware at this time to be built in Golang, but this is kind of an interesting choice, which is why I mention it. And they use Tor for communications. Ransom demands a little bit lower than some of the other threat actors. They're looking for 3 Bitcoins from what we've seen for decrypting an individual system, or, you know, let's call it up to 15 Bitcoin to decrypt the entire network. So that's, you know, $150,000 roughly to decrypt your entire enterprise. They do monitor open source intelligence, so they're watching, they're Googling for themselves, and they're pretty aggressive in responding to any media claims about what they're doing. They've actually leaked sensitive information from some of their victims from what we've seen. They delete backups, logs, shadow copies. They prevent safe boot so that you can't really restore easily, and they use AES 256 encryption to encrypt the files, which is pretty common for these ransom attacks. So I just want to take a couple of 45 seconds, so I'll fly through this. Geopolitical hacktivism is the other kind of thing that I didn't cover from a threat to the public sector. So we've seen a lot of geopolitical hacktivism on a lot of different targets. They're regionally focused, so there's actors in Turkey that we track that target media, government, etc. And just to give you kind of an overview of what this landscape looks like, you can get a sense here. We've seen hacktivist activity in Latin America pertaining to Venezuela and to Nicaragua. We've seen lots of hacktivist activity in the Middle East. Globally, hacktivism kind of gets focused on geopolitical issues in the US. You can see things like, I can't really read them that well from here, but you can see lots of different topics that they go after. They go after capitalism, they go after finance, they go after the Op USA, which is pretty broad, just targeting the USA, Op Gov, targeting the US Gov. So hacktivists tend to try to leak information, they try to disrupt systems, and they try to create defacements. So it's a pretty consistent problem and one to be aware of. It's not necessarily one that's going to have significant impact on an organization, but it can be a bit embarrassing and cause a bit of a black eye. And as they say, that they do not forgive, they do not forget. Expect them, so you should. And I'll conclude here with just kind of an assessment that we made and kind of wrapping up the overall intelligence perspective here. Everybody know this guy? Yeah. So he looks super uncomfortable in that chair, first of all. But intelligence can tell you, a lot of times what people call intelligence is what happened already. They're talking about indicators, they're talking about hashes and malware and things that we know about that have happened. And intelligence, if you remember to the initial quote about trying to understand what the adversary would deny you, kind of quick little thought exercise here. So we looked at what Kim Jong-un said in the New Year's Day address. He does it every year. And this year, He mentioned economy twice as many times as he did last year. If you look at some of the initiatives within North Korea, there's the National Economic Development Strategy, where they seek to improve the country's economy and the quality of life for North Koreans by 2020. So tick-tock on that one. And when, his policy has always been to have nuclear security and economic security. And they already kind of called, a win on nuclear security. They've been able to demonstrate weapons. They've been able to demonstrate intercontinental ballistic missiles. So they're kind of now focusing on the economy. And we look at what the 6 key areas that they're focused on in the National Economic Development Strategy. It's energy, mining, agriculture, machinery, land management, and international trade. So from a public sector perspective, I think international trade would be one that certainly would be of interest to them and for you in this room. And we believe that they're likely to start to engage in economic espionage against the US and Western targets as they seek to meet the objective of that National Economic Development Strategy, which was launched in 2016 and expires next year. And so that is what I have. I don't know if we're doing questions. Somebody drop something. Are we doing questions, or should I just jump off the stage and smoke bomb? All right, thank you all.